Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in all kinds of layers of stuff, challenges, political, climatic, geopolitical, and on down the list. Maybe there'll be another pandemic, just to throw in a wrench, given what's happening with bird flu. I'm Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What, trying to navigate complex issues through conversations and to get to the other side with some sense of where we go on these tough issues. And I'm really thrilled this morning to have Harry Stevens on, who has been at the Washington Post running what he calls Climate Lab. It's a column. Some of it has been sort of news you can use. And I mean, this is news you can use. And I wanted to quickly, before we get into the story he has published today, which is a really deep look at a very popular metric, NOAA's $1 billion weather and climate disasters tallies. And he's done a really deep look at issues and insights there and where we go with that related to climate change. But I wanted to quickly touch on, how you got to where you are now. So,
Sure.
Because it's a sort of an unusual approach to the climate question. And I think it did, if I got it correct, it started out sort of as a reader service. But what got you into this mess we call climate change and climate policy and climate risk?
My background's in graphics. So, I mean, journalism and graphics. So I've been doing both now for a while. But my first job at the Washington Post was on the graphics team. So, making maps and charts and things like that. But I've always been interested in climate change. The first project I worked on at the Post was the 2C series, which
Right.
looked at which parts of the world have already warmed by more than 2 degrees Celsius, and since like the pre-industrial era. And I came in sort of when they'd already started, and then we ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize, mostly for other people's work. So that was pretty sweet. It's like the
Yeah.
first thing I worked on at the Post. But then, so I've been doing, different sorts of things. I was covering politics and this and that, but then this position opened up to write a column about climate change that would be like graphics and data driven, but also, have a different perspective, or maybe, focus on more hard science kind of stuff. So that's what I do. I do a lot of stories where like you can look up where you live and see how some variable has changed over time, like how the temperature has changed in winter versus summer, or how climatic conditions for mosquitoes may have improved or gotten worse over time. So it's a lot of that kind of stuff, like how has the climatic conditions where you live changed.
Right.
But this one, is just an obviously data-driven story, and I think that if you focus a lot on data, then I think it's natural to raise your eyebrows a little bit at some of the ways that this data set gets used. And so that's what drew me to it, is like, it's just this interesting story about how people interpret data, what you notice and what you overlook, and how sometimes science can get used for rhetorical purposes that it's not really suited for. So that's what I
Right.
really thought. That's what drew me to this story.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of that. Sometimes there's an eagerness to push an agenda beyond the science for the sake of what Mike Hume in England, who's a longtime climate policy researcher, he says there's the noble lie, which Aristotle, I think, referred to, meaning you're not exactly true, but there's a good purpose. I did a conversation with Mike Hume on that, and the word lie is kind of a hard word. It's mostly sort of bending and spinning and shaping of stories, and it's been an amazingly popular metric in the news. Here's just an example of this year's tally, which does not include the newest hurricanes, and it's quite a busy map.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be a big one for obvious reasons, well over 100 billion, I'm sure, and you tally all that stuff up. And you see the headlines. There's the one, the U.S. This is from their release in January last. They sort of tie climate change there into the
Oh
idea
yeah.
of historic $1 billion disasters. It's kind of like saying two different things, lumping them together and making a point. And then the media mostly pick up on this. You see there are lots of headlines from this kind of tally. It's interesting to see Ron Bailey, who's been writing about this stuff since the 80s, like me, but writes for the sort of libertarian Reason. He's the only one who said, no, this isn't a tally of climate change. It's a tally of climate loss, and that's different.
Right.
And then there are other entities. It's not just NOAA, Climate Central, which is, a really good operation. Just very interesting things there in New Jersey. But they're very much making a case. They're selling concern about climate change, and in one of their releases, they talk about disasters. They kind of conflate disasters and hazards.
Right.
And the disaster, as all my disaster researcher friends say, is a function of human behavior or misbehavior. It's not the hazard is here. The disaster is a function of what we do or don't do.
Right. Hazards are natural, but disasters are man-made.
Yeah. So you started to dig in on this. So you've been at this story for a while, right?
Yeah, I've been interested in it for years, and really been reporting on it for the last, on and off for the last like 6 months, and then more intensely lately. But yeah, I think that this quote from Jim Baker that you have up on the screen, kind of summarizes it. That it's a plausible hypothesis that global warming has caused at least a portion of the increase in billion-dollar disasters. But one of my favorite quotes about science is from this designer and engineer that I really like named Brett Victor. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but he says something like, rhetoric is trying to convince people you're right, and science is trying by every conceivable means to convince people that you're wrong and failing.
Huh.
And
that's a good one.
I think that that's not what's going on here. I think that this is more rhetoric than science, because when people have tried to statistically link global warming to the rise in billion-dollar disasters, they haven't succeeded for the most part. And there's some nuance there that we can explore if you want to get into some esoteric debates about data sets. But the point is that, like, for the most part, even if global warming's influence can be detected in the rise of billion-dollar disasters, it's very, very small in comparison to the role of societal growth and risky development. And so if you're going to cite the billion-dollar disaster data set in the context of climate change, you have to mention that these societal factors have played the larger part in the rise. And it's not, I don't think it's illegitimate to say, scientists are investigating global warming's role in the rise of disasters, or we're trying to link it, but we haven't established the link yet. But just to come out and cite this data set as evidence of global warming is, it's misleading. I don't know. Noble lie is a strong phrase, but it's misleading.
Yeah, and now I'm gonna literally spin through your story on camera here, and in a little while, Jessica Wenkel, who you cite her work in one of your graphs, is going to join us just to sort of give her reaction.
Oh, great! She's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think she really has had a fresh perspective on this. So you kind of, here's the data, of course, and that's a pretty powerful curve. And then you start to kind of take this into its pieces. Here's Lawrence Bauer, someone that I started writing about in 2010, who says, we know climate change is real. Absolutely. We don't see it in the economic losses yet. And that's for several different reasons. And then here's Adam Smith. You quote the guy who's really been running this billion-dollar disaster project for a while. And he's making the point that climate change, the extremes in the hazards are ramping up. So why do you think we have a hard time, if you do think, distinguishing those two things, that hazards can change disaster losses can change, and they're not
Yeah.
necessarily the same, and not necessarily the same thing.
I think it's about like what people are inclined to notice and what we're inclined to ignore or overlook. So like a hurricane or a wildfire, they're like these really vivid events,
Right.
almost like a plane crash. And so, you see these things and you see the disaster that results from them, and people are saying, well, global warming is intensifying these hazards. And so you just assume that if the damage from them is increasing, it's because the hazard itself is increasing.
Right.
But the sort of thing that you overlook is like this gradual growth. Like you're not watching St. Petersburg, Florida grow day by day and year after year, right? You're not watching people building houses in the forests in California and Colorado slowly, slowly over time. And the thing is though, that after a long enough time, like that growth just comes to overwhelm any climate change driven increase, even though the results of climate change, or I mean, you can't say the results of climate change, but the big weather events, the extreme weather events are much more vivid. So you're just more likely to notice them.
Right. And then when you put the political or policy context on top of that, the need for messaging to be sort of simple and straightforward seems to dominate. And I think part of this, I've written about global warming since 1988, and I definitely get the sense that those pushing for action, including journalists who, take a certain stance on this, have become so frustrated with the inability to nudge the emissions side.
Yeah.
Are just trying different ways to alarm us or activate us, and these other data just get lost. Here again, I want to circle back to Lawrence Bauer, who's in the Netherlands, a longtime IPCC author. I cited him back in 2010. Study finds no links tying disaster losses to human-driven warming. It's because of all the other factors going into how much stuff, property and wealth and people are in harm's way. And here in your piece, he says a lot of the things we see in the disaster losses are obscured because there's an overwhelming signal of more people in risky places, growing populations worldwide, more infrastructure, more assets, higher values, 5-time IPCC lead author. This is the main signal. And that's where the science is at the moment. And yet that's not where the rhetoric is. So again, your piece really, I think, has done a valuable service by really laying this out. You talked to some of the early researchers, Tom Ross and Neil Lott.
Yeah, track those guys down. They're retired.
Well, they were at Asheville
guys.
too. Are they still at Asheville, which got hammered by Helene?
Yeah, they are. They both are there. They both got hit pretty hard by the storm, though they were okay. They suffered some property damage. I mean, Tom Ross, like both these guys are like huge weather nerds since childhood. So they both still have like weather stations at their houses. And so Tom's weather station was destroyed by Helene. He had like trees falling all over his property, trees falling through the roof, pretty bad. But they have like a backup generator and they pump their own water. So they were okay. But like just up the road from them, there were landslides that killed like 12 people. So, I mean, obviously it was just a horrible. And
disaster. Still is. It's still unfolding and heavily politicized again.
Yes.
Although Harris has not been making climate a foreground issue here, which I think is wise given where she is in the race, just personally. And then you talk to some other folks. They were doing the basic studies early on of, how do you tally the monetary losses in disasters? How do you characterize what's special about the $1 billion threshold too? That's in your piece.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that sort of suggests that the $1 billion disaster data set, not that it was designed for rhetorical purposes, but it sort of suggests its rhetorical intent, right? Because $1 billion is not like the billion is not a number that's found in nature, right? Like we use a decimal number system because we have 10 fingers, and billion is a 1 with 9 zeros after it. Right. And so, when something crosses that threshold, that's like, whoa, $1 billion. And so that's kind of eye catching. But But of course, like the number of disasters across that threshold is going to increase over time, as Ross
Yeah, you got
says.
Ross. You quote Ross here. He says it doesn't take as much to get to $1 billion now.
Yeah. And it's like, actually, if you don't, I mean, when you take a second to think about it, it's obvious, but if you're not sort of guided to look at the data this way, you can really overlook this fact. And this
Yeah.
is also like, this is after adjusting for inflation. It's just because there's more people in the way, more
Yeah,
people, more stuff.
and that, NOAA began including inflation adjustment in its tallies, but then that's when researchers like, let's scroll through. This is
Yeah,
your
this is just
great,
explaining detection and attribution.
yeah, right, in the hazard, right, in the climate system. And then it's the question is detecting and attributing losses from the social side of the system. And you had here Chris Lancy, who's a longtime hurricane researcher, still at NOAA, and Roger Pilkey Jr., who has led since he was a kid. You can see right there, he's literally a kid. And the story of how he came to do this work is really interesting. But they started to figure out, well, can you account for those changes, right? This is this weird word, normalization,
Yeah.
which you get at too.
Yeah.
How do you summarize that?
It's crazy that Roger's been having the same argument for 30 years.
I know.
Like you can go back and read, early pre-internet stuff that like you can find in, journals where he's fighting with people about, whether disaster losses are a sign of climate change. And he's still doing that, on his Substack. And, but yeah, I mean, so the basic idea is like, well, let's actually try to solve this problem. So we have a tally of economic losses from hurricanes. How do we disentangle the role of societal growth in that data set? And like, there's no way to do it perfectly. Like you don't know like every single building that's been built over time in every single place, and how much they cost, and you don't know what kind of flood control measures or how building codes have changed. Like it's really hard to quantify every single thing that contributes to disaster losses. But even if you do like just a basic, we're going to count how many people are in the way of hurricanes, and we're going to count what's like the wealth of the counties that are hit by hurricanes. And so that's what they did. And they, once you factor those two things out, population and wealth, the trend just disappears.
Right.
And like, there could be other things that, after you consider them, like if you consider, building codes or, the way that people have been trying to adapt to weather in general, not necessarily climate change, but weather in general, you might have a different trend. But the point is that like, this is the best available science we have on trying to understand society's role in disaster losses. And as you can see, they don't show a trend. And so if you're going to claim that global warming is causing an increase in disaster losses, it's incumbent upon you as a scientist to prove it, while also remember trying to prove yourself wrong, right? So you go into it with a hypothesis that you try to prove it wrong. And if you fail to prove that hypothesis wrong, then you know that you're correct. And, the problem with a lot of research on global warming, and this in particular, is that, it is so politicized, and people, go in with a hypothesis that they, sort of think is true from the very beginning, and then they do everything they can to prove it while potentially ignoring counter evidence.
Yeah, and here's this line that you cite Roger Pilkey saying the degree of societal change dwarfs expected climate changes by orders of magnitude. That's not to say climate change isn't important, and he has said repeatedly for decades it is important, it has to be addressed. It's just to say that we humans are really transforming the surface of the earth in really profound ways too.
Yeah. And it's interesting that Roger Pilkey Jr. has become this sort of lightning rod of, debate. And certainly a lot of people are, put off by him. He's alienated other researchers, and he does have a kind of combative style. But, a lot of times people end up refuting arguments that he's not making. So, he'll say we can't detect global warming's influence in disaster losses statistically. And then people will come back to him and say, well, what are you saying? Global warming's not real? And he just says, no, that's not what I've never said that.
Yeah. And the media, if you look, I'm sure it'd be possible to do a Google search and see his name kind of vanish from news articles. He got kind of, as I've said in this graphic I used when I had him on a conversation earlier this year, he who must not be named refuses to go away. He has a new paper out in one of the Nature journals on laying out his argument for deep concern about the data set for the $1 billion disasters. And I just saw Jessica Winkle is in the green room having some coffee.
Great.
She'll be joining us in a second. There's bagels in the corner. Just digital bagels. I'll come on in a minute. And I thought I was going to just play a 2-minute clip from Roger that lays out this challenge, I think, in a very objective way. Hold on, let me see if I can do that. Video file. And again, thanks for your time, especially in the middle of a year and a month and a week like this one. Harry Stevens for being on the show. Following Roger for years on social media, you'll see a number of his colleagues and many media reporters have blocked this guy. So I have not. I continue to find you, Roger, an invaluable source of data-driven reality checks on issues that get kind of carried away. Literally, the narratives just keep going, and so it's disastrous to me how the media have covered disasters and how politicians feed into that. It's kind of a self-replicating loop of missing the point. The point being we've built exposure and pockets of vulnerability to the hazards that are in the system already. And those hazards can be changing. Some of them are demonstrably changing. But you talk to, Steve Strader and Walker Ashley, who actually map this stuff. They call it expanding bullseye work. It's like, hey, look at Florida. And so again, are we just stuck with a human inability to sort of pull these two frames into how we think about something? Or what do you think has happened in the way the climate problem has evolved that seems to make it almost impossible to break that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I don't think there's anything inevitable about it. And I'd recommend anybody listening to go to your interview with Mike Hume, who promotes this notion of climatism. Not my favorite term, but there is this idea that, and it goes back a long time, that we can reduce everything to climate. And there is this tendency. It's in academia, it's in the media, it's in politics. There's a lot of reasons for it. I remember when we did our first studies looking at hurricane damage in the 1990s, me and Chris Lancy, who's now at the National Hurricane Center, somewhere near the top of that institution. And we pointed out that, the overwhelming responsibility for increasing damage was more people, more property, more wealth, which seems pretty obvious when you think about it. But we're not really good at looking at this intersection of a vulnerable and exposed society and extreme events and disentangling everything that's going on. People like their answers short, sweet, simple. And also, we can talk about this too. There is an element of science politics behind it.
That's good enough, but that he gets at this. The societal communication reality is we like things short, sweet, and simple. And this is not like that. So I'm glad, I'm hoping there's a way to cut through some of the sort of personal rancor around how this plays out and to get more of a focus on the data. There are just these epic battles on social media between and here's Jessica. Jessica, I realize I don't know fully how to pronounce your last name. Is it Winkle or Winkle?
Yeah, it's Winkle, like Rip Van Winkle.
Yeah, and you're in North Carolina, right?
I am. Coastal North Carolina. And interestingly, relevant to this, which you guys are talking about, there was just a press release by one of the local environmental groups, but they were talking about some issues going on in Brunswick County, and which is just the county next to us that's hurricane prone, and their difficulty in managing development relative to the stormwater infrastructure that they have, the emergency management infrastructure that they have available. So I don't know. I thought it was timely.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit. Your data are in Harry's story in one of the graphs. And what's been your work on hurricanes particularly, or just this general field of attributing both changes in the storms and changes in their impacts?
Yeah. So so I should say, I always preface that I'm Roger's graduate student, so I'm of that lineage.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he was.
Oh, then we can't trust you at all. Just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. He was my chair on my committee, on my doctoral committee. So that I got brought in on that project as in updating what he and a number of other colleagues had done in, I want to say 2005. And so I updated the data set. I worked with them to update the data set. And, but it's also been, so my experience with it is also watching the entire evolution of the narrative, and then his experience with blogging and all that, and becoming really engaged and concerned about science and dominant narratives and how things just kind of take on a life of their own, even though they're not accurate.
Right. And you've been writing about this increasingly. You're now on Substack, like I am. I'm showing a piece that's obviously relevant. The other work that I don't think is in Harry's piece, which is incredibly thorough and can't possibly capture everything, is Steve Strader and Walker Ashley have done this technique of mapping exposure, particularly exposure change in zones of hazard. And I first started writing about Strader in 2017 in a piece at ProPublica on development and disasters. And it seems so clear, just as we've been saying from the work of Lawrence Bauer and others, that for some reason we discount this arena of growth in zones of hazard. And there's the formula for risk is hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Risk is you have to have a hazard to have risk, but you have to have exposure and vulnerability. If we all lived in bubbles, we wouldn't be having these conversations. So Harry,
Jessica and we talked a bit while I was reporting on the story, and she's got. I ended up not quoting her, so sorry about that, Jessica. But yeah, she's got really interesting insights too into like how insurance prices can incentivize or disincentivize behavior that is risky, and whether it's good for society or bad for society. I mean, it's really nuanced. That like all of the economic factors and societal factors that go into rising disaster costs. And I mean, there's not always like an easy answer. Like some people will read this and they'll say like, well, just stop building on the coast. But if we didn't build on the coast, then like we wouldn't have a lot of stuff that we like. So it's not always obvious like what to do about this. But I think that even if we were to turn off every single coal plant tomorrow, while that would have many benefits, it would not stop there being hurricane disasters that cost $1 billion.
Right. And Jessica, what's your take on that? It does seem, as we were saying earlier too, the pressure for decarbonization action, which seems so hard, feels to me like it has caused people to shy away from the dual message of dealing with exposure and vulnerability. And the vulnerability part, exposure is just stuff, and that could be wealthy exposure that's got insurance. The vulnerability part is mostly poor people and marginalized communities. Thinking of the Western North Carolina impacts are a mixture. But most of the people who were hammered there, I think, were not wealthy. Many were not insured. And the other factor that gets missed is we don't really understand the full scope of these hazards either. That's for another conversation. I've had conversations with paleo climate scientists who say, you know, and actually, Harry, I think you mentioned in the piece the Asheville flooding. You know, there were warnings. There was a 1916 Great Flood. There was a 1791 Great Flood. It happens to be that extreme events are rare. So having statistical robustness about their return periods and the like are really is hard unless you're looking on these long time scales. So that's a third factor. You got exposure, vulnerability, and history, and that gets lost too. Harry, maybe Harry and then Jessica on that.
Yeah, I mean, we just had a story in the Washington Post about some development that's going on in Galveston. And, you know, there's been sea level rise in Galveston, as there have been in a lot of coastal places, and people are concerned about potentially more intense, like, you know, wind speeds or rainfall during storms and hurricanes. But you got to remember that, like, the reason that they built the seawall in Galveston was not because of climate change. It was because Galveston was destroyed by a hurricane, I think in 1905. And
Right.
then they built a seawall there. And now they're trying to build luxury condominiums outside of the area of the seawall.
Yeah.
Well, that would have been dangerous and risky in 1905 too, right?
Right.
So that's not a climate change issue necessarily. I mean, climate change might enhance the hazard, but, you know, building in Galveston with no protection from storms is dangerous, no matter when you do it or whether there's climate change. And, you know, I got into this a little bit with the flooding in Appalachia, but, you know, in the mid 20th century, early mid 20th century, the Tennessee Valley Authority built a lot of flood control dams on the Tennessee River and surrounding area. And, you know, those flood control dams, when operating correctly, can really prevent a lot of damage. You know, the TVA estimates that since 1932, I believe, their flood control dams have prevented about 10 or $9.6 billion in economic losses. And I mean, that's their number. And,
Right.
you know, I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but in general, like, inland flooding is like highly mediated by the stuff that people build to prevent it, right? Dams, canals, dikes. And in the, you know, mid 20th century, and really in the 60s, the TVA had a plan to put 14 flood control dams on the French Broad River upstream of Asheville. And, you know, you can go back and read their reports. I got the Tennessee Valley Authority's librarian to send me all of these reports where they're analyzing, you know, what they think these flood control dams will do and what they think the impacts are going to be.
Right.
And, you know, they're basically just like, yeah, we think that, you know, this region floods all the time. And, you know, if we can control the flooding, then there'll be more economic activity. You know, things won't get destroyed as much. Wouldn't that be really nice? Now, the TVA also had a reputation for, like, dispossessing people of their land,
Right.
you know, just for steamrolling people, for using eminent domain to just, you know, kick people off their property, basically. And, you know, that wasn't very popular. And those dams certainly would have changed people's way of life, you know, who lived on the French Broad River in Western North Carolina. You know, people use that river for all sorts of things, you know, canoeing and fishing and various other economic activities. And it would have kicked people off their land. And so there was really strong political opposition to that TVA project. And because of that political opposition, TVA canceled those dams in 1972. And so, you know, it's impossible to say exactly how those dams would have performed during Hurricane Helene, whether they would have prevented some of the catastrophic flooding in Asheville, but they may have. And the point in general is just that, you know, you don't see, you know, how many dams are there and how well they performed in the economic damage from hurricanes, right?
Right.
So if you just use hurricane damage, the economic damage, to talk about climate change or to talk about the hazard in general, you're missing a huge amount of activity that goes into influencing these costs. If you don't account for that, I mean, you know, you're just not really being rigorous enough to make a strong claim.
Yeah. So this is a good time to turn to the sort of what next part of the conversation. You know, you, Harry, as a journalist, Jessica, as a scientist at this interface between data and decision making. Here's just another image. This was in 2017 or 2018. It was ahead of Florence, where Steve actually issued kind of a damage forecast as Florence was heading toward the Carolinas, showing just how much the exposure had changed. It's 1,325% increase in the number of homes within the cone, the possible cone of that hurricane. And he says we have to kind of integrate better that understanding of driving losses from these events, along with thinking about the long-term issue of reducing emissions, which hurricanes are complicated even in terms of global warming. So Harry, for the media, your story is an outlier. And what do we need to do, if anything? Can data make a difference in our reporting? Actually, after Steve did this, I kind of ended up getting him in touch with the op-ed section of the Times, and they ran an op-ed by him. And I wondered if maybe there's a way to have a real-time forecasting, not just of the weather, but of the exposure and vulnerability. Like, can we have a vulnerability forecast so people really understand which parts of a river valley need to evacuate and that kind of thing? And so Steve, maybe Harry first on the media challenge, and then Jessica on the same question.
I think with regard to the media, I mean, there is a range of legitimate opinion, I think, on how hazard has changed, and I get into this a bit later in the piece. So looking at long-term data and trying to find trends and attribute their causes. So specifically long-term data, decades or centuries, preferably of like temperature or hurricane activity or whatever. This is called detection and attribution, generally, by scientists. And so that is a more sort of well-established statistical method. First you detect the trend, then you try to figure out what caused it. And over the last 20 years, there's a sort of emerging statistical technique called event attribution, where you look at a single observed event, and then you try to figure out how its probabilities may have changed due to greenhouse gas emissions or increased greenhouse gas content in the atmosphere. And this is like a really popular statistical technique, and a lot of people cite these studies as evidence that hazards are getting stronger. And so if hazards are getting stronger, it seems reasonable to assume that economic losses are increasing. And I think that it's an argument that I represent in the story, and I think that people should consider it. And so I think that if journalists are putting out that argument or embracing that argument, I think that's legitimate. Although I also think that they should consider alternative arguments. But that's like one of the nice things about, at least from my perspective, like working in a big newsroom with a lot of people. People are going to have different perspectives, and they can disagree, and readers can kind of decide for themselves. But I do agree with you that I think that there has been much more emphasis on climate change's role in increasing the hazard, and probably too little attention paid to the role of risky development and increased population.
And Jessica, what do you think about this?
I think that the focus on climate change, as important as climate change is, really muddles a lot of other social problems that America has, if not other nations. And I see it. You had mentioned the insurance thing that I've talked about in the past. Like, I'm not an insurance executive, right? And I don't know what to do about it, but I do know that as long as they keep that narrative buried underneath a whole misrepresentation of climate change knowledge, like the public, our policymakers, the industry itself can't get traction with it to try and come up with good alternatives to deal with it. And that's the same thing with our development. We don't talk about it. And I'm not anti-development. I'm not even anti-coastal development. But but we're doing it, and we need to do it better. If losses and if vulnerability is something we care about, and we all say that we do. So it's just it buries some serious problems that we have, that we collectively care about too. It's not like a right left thing. And when it gets buried in climate change, it becomes divisive, and it doesn't need to be, because it is a broad social issue that I think is of a shared concern.
Yeah, and you're right. Your column on Substack is really helpful at getting at some of these details, including. Let me just show folks. Whoops, why isn't that showing? Hold on one second. You kind of illustrate, again, the data are there for sure. It's just a matter of us finding the motivation to look at them and to see how that relates to things like zoning, building codes. It's encouraging to me what's happening with real estate listings. There's recent news that Zillow has joined those. They use First Street's data to give a sort of a climate risk picture when you're buying a home. When I bought our place here on the coast of an inlet in Maine, I was very aware of the sea level question, and I think about it all the time because we live 16 feet above high tide, and high tide, the sea level's rising. And in fact, it's rising more rapidly in Maine than many other places. But the average person isn't thinking about this. I think one of the communication opportunities is not necessarily in journalism; it's in around this kind of thing, like how we.
And I mean, that's kind of, I mean, insurance prices could potentially convey that information without people having to do research about like the historical meteorology of where they live. I mean, that's, prices can convey information. Like when you buy a pencil, you don't know how much it costs to mine aluminum or graphite or whatever, like the rubber, but you kind of, that's what the price of the pencil kind of represents. But I'm not an expert on insurance markets, and I think there are good reasons for price ceilings and stuff like that that I'm just not an expert on at all, or government subsidized insurance, things like that. But suffice to say that when there are interventions in insurance markets by the government, that the prices probably no longer convey all of the risk that they otherwise would.
Right. Well, one thing we clearly need is more stories like the one you published to at least get these conversations going. And there are others. Chris Flavell at the Times has written a lot about this. Sometimes I've criticized him a little bit on the climatism point, that there's still a climate forward angle, and some of that's editing. I was at the Times for 21 years, and I saw how editors and the way a story gets onto a front page as opposed to an internet page involved thinking, well, how climate change is the story, so where's the climate angle here? And that can kind of bias the whole thing toward the climate change component, which is, again, important, but not something it's not a knob you can turn now and see results within the next few decades either, the delay factor. So Jessica, when you look at this story, does this feel like a breakthrough to you? It feels like a breakthrough to me to a certain extent.
Because it provides context for this discussion that's going on, and that is not easily, it's not easily accessible. It's not, I wouldn't say it's in the weeds, but it's the background of how our narratives and where our information comes from. And it's particularly the $1 billion disaster imagery is so, it's almost like iconic, right? Like it's this image that everybody sees again, but doesn't really think about where it comes from. And it's tied in with this story about climate change that is inaccurate, but it's so prevalent that nobody even really thinks about it. And so, and I say nobody, I mean, in speaking with students over the years, and Andy, I'm sure you've had this experience where you get this new batch of students within a similar age range every year. And you get a sense that people that even care about the issue are unaware of the background dynamics of how these stories come about.
Well, and I think, education around climate is fraught also, all the way down the chain. In Texas and Florida, it's a miracle it can even get mentioned by a teacher. But Kim Cobb, who used to be in Georgia, she's now at Brown University, climate scientist, told me a story about I think, chemistry teacher at her kids' high school who was essentially completely rejecting global warming in the classroom. And her son, I think her son came home and was all upset about that. So when I think maybe one way around that bollocks is to have kids learn about risk. Climate risk is very different than climate change. Climate change is one driver of risk, but if you take away that component of this issue that seems to divide and confuse people more than clarify, and put in the foreground, let's talk about climate risk. There's no community I know on Earth that wants to be in a state of risk to flooding or heat or whatever. And then you can break it down. Well, what components are driving risk? How much of it is exposure? How much is vulnerability? For heat waves, it's almost all vulnerability. And I've had many conversations on this webcast about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about, Andy, is why do people cite this $1 billion disaster data set as evidence of climate change? And there are lots of very prominent mentions of it. I mean, I only looked at the ones from the White House, really, in the piece, where the Biden administration has just implied that the $1 billion disaster, the rise in $1 billion disasters, might be 100% attributable to climate change.
Right.
I mean, they haven't actually said that explicitly, but when they've mentioned the $1 billion disaster data set, they haven't mentioned the role of societal growth at all. So a reader coming to that might reasonably conclude that climate change is completely the cause of that growth.
Right.
And it's why do this? When it goes against the scientific consensus. And I get into it a little bit at the end of the piece, but probably the basic reason is just that people care more about economic issues than environmental issues. And that's reflected repeatedly in polling. People rank the economy at or near the top of the issues that they care about the most, and the environment or climate change at or near the bottom generally.
Right.
And so if you can make climate change an economic issue, then the idea is that you'll get people to care about it more. And I think that that's the logic behind it. I think the peril there is that scientists who do that risk undermining the credibility of much sturdier science. And you look at, I cited in my piece, the way the detection and attribution studies of average global temperature are really, really strong science. You have, people argue about that too, as they should. Science is all about a big argument, but this is really strong evidence that greenhouse gas emissions are the main cause of the average global temperature increase since the pre-industrial era. But if you say we have this evidence, and then we also have this evidence that also $1 billion disasters are increasing because of it.
Right.
And then people find out that the argument behind the $1 billion disaster thing is much less strong. They might also think, well, were you also lying to me about that temperature thing too? And so I just think that there is a peril of mixing rhetoric, or at least with science, or at least not being completely clear about what the evidentiary basis is of a scientific claim and what the uncertainties are. And I understand scientists' impulse to want to get people to care about climate change, because it is a really serious thing, and it's hard to get people to care about, to make short-term sacrifices to avert future catastrophes. But there's just this clear risk that scientists could undermine their credibility, and I think that there's some evidence that that's happened. I think that there are a lot of people who just don't believe things that climate scientists say, and that's not entirely the fault of climate scientists, but I think it could be partially their fault.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what you guys think of that. I'm just talking here.
Well, Jessica, one thing that comes to mind for me is, and this has been true globally, when there's a disaster, local politicians, the last thing they want to do is acknowledge local responsibility. And this was true in Pakistan, where the leader of Pakistan, after the Great Flood there, made it all about carbon dioxide from rich countries. And this is because of the climate treaty context. You owe us money, reparations for all this damage. She said nothing about the historic inability of Pakistan to manage its water, to manage poorly managed dams and levees, and huge population surges in floodplains. So that's there. Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the victims were mostly from poor, marginal immigrants to the city of Tacloban, who lived in a floodplain and didn't have any place to live. In California, Gavin Newsom, and before him, Jerry Brown, every time there was a wildfire that I wrote about the last 15 or so years, it was all about global warming, not about telling Californians, if you're going to live in forests, you have to live with wildfire. And we need to figure out how to have better building codes and planning. So I think a big issue driving what Harry has talked about is more that is a big part of it. It's easier to point the finger at a global thing and not say, well, we need to manage our community growth better, that kind of thing. I don't know if you feel that, either of you.
No, I do. And there's been writing on this a little bit, that it's very difficult to keep local policymakers, like your planning commission, accountable for the state of disasters, right? But that's where the decision making is taking place about how our land is used and building codes. And well, I don't know. I'm not quite sure exactly unit that where building codes come from. But some of it is local, and I think some of it's state level. But that's where the key decision making is made, and that resulting in the outcomes that we have. And you can see it with coastal management specifically, because they have so many variances. So there's like a regulatory code, and then somebody comes in, they're like, yeah, but I need this, or I want to develop that. And through negotiation and lawyers and all that, they often get what they want. And that's not climate change. That's just like an ability to keep people accountable for the rules that are set. Yeah.
Anyway, and Harry, thinking forward, does that feel like it resonated with your reporting at all, or is that a sort of a separate part of it? This idea of local accountability angle.
I mean, I didn't report on that part of it, but we have quite a lot. I mean, you can look at like my coworker Brianna Sachs has written a bunch about like the fires in Maui. I think that last year, and a lot of the sort of local decisions that contributed to that. And it's definitely like I think that if you're a climate reporter or a climate reporter, environmental reporter, that's something that you should really be looking into, because they're like if you're a reporter and you're trying to hold people accountable for their decisions and how their decisions impact vulnerable people, like that's a good place to mine.
Right. I have a whole tutorial I've built for some work I've done with developing country journalists on reporting local climate risk in a human jolted climate. And I think it's a way to kind of help, especially with journalists who are new to the beat, to break some of the patterns that have been out there that I think tend to have I talk about what's called narrative capture. Newsrooms can be captured by a narrative. And I was, my global warming stories for the first 20 years were mostly about global warming from CO2, not about the vulnerability component, until I started talking to a lot more social scientists and geographers.
Another thing that I just would mention is that if journalists, we get these press releases all the time. If you're not a journalist, you might not be aware of this, but we just get emails inundated daily from various different organizations, government groups, UN bodies with different research that they've published. And also there's like this incentive for journalists to keep publishing stuff, and probably more now than there was even 20 years ago, because we're competing with like all this stuff on the internet that's like, free, and people like it more than reading the news. And so like there's this kind of dynamic that happens where like, you get some report that's like climate change did this thing and caused this thing. And then, you're like, well, I need a story, boom. And then it becomes a story. Without having like really dug into the methodology. So like, I'll just give you an example. I once saw a press release that was saying that, climate change will cause more domestic abuse in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
So like, to be clear, like domestic abuse is like a really serious thing in sub-Saharan Africa or anywhere else. But like, there might be some statistical correlation between like temperature and incidence of domestic abuse, if they can even have reliable data on that in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
But like, to suggest that temperature is the cause of domestic abuse, or that like installing more solar panels will like alleviate the suffering of women who are abused in Africa, is crazy. Like that's crazy. And that's kind of like an extreme example, but there's a lot of stuff like that, where like,
totally.
I understand the temptation to like write that story, like climate change is making domestic abuse worse in Africa, but that's not really good science. And if you're serious about people who are like actually suffering from this kind of problems, like don't just grab at the climate change thing.
Yeah, amid all the pressure to do just that, unfortunately, because in our clicky news environment, you're rewarded more for that momentary headline than for the systemic solution-based approach that you're taking and you're reporting. We have a few more minutes, and there's a substantial audience, so if you can stay on a little longer, that would be great. I'm actually going to show a couple of slides from that primer I do, because I think they're worth hammering in just this context. Even what you were saying about sub-Saharan Africa domestic violence and heat or like, if the journalist and or the public in their head can just stop and say, okay, hazard, risk, exposure, vulnerability, what are the factors looking at that? And then what do we know about changes in the hazard? In sub-Saharan Africa, IPCC reports say they don't even know if it's going to get wetter or drier, for example. So if you're talking about drought pressures on farmers, and the models are still divided on whether it's going to get wetter or drier, then blaming global warming for a drought is certainly specious at best. And so it feels like a good starting point. Hold on one second. I'm just gonna. So this is jumping right into the middle of something, so global warming is from these gases getting into the atmosphere. And then what is climate risk? It's, again, this is from all my disaster researcher friends: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. The hazard is changing for some things from global warming. Like tornadoes are kind of complicated. Some aspects of hurricanes are complicated. But heat is not complicated, more rain, etc. So the hazard can change. Exposure has changed everywhere. And, that's what we were just talking about. Vulnerability is societal. It's about who's excluded from protection, who's poor, who's in harm's way. And I've discussed that a lot. There's this great model from the 70s by Ben Wisner and others of a pressure model for disasters, which is you can list the factors in society that lead toward vulnerability, so that when the hazard strikes, you have a disaster. And there's a pressure model and a release model. And we think of disaster, I'm not going to play that right now. And then there's this one. Climate risk is the probability of harm, not the probability of the storm. And geographers get this. Climate scientists sometimes don't. Hopefully you can hear this. I'm not sure if you can. Hold on.
When we talk about climate risk, some people still just think, it's the probability of a heat wave. But we need to think about risk not as the probability of the heat wave, but as the probability of harm.
I mean, that says so much right there. Hopefully you could hear it.
In addition to sort of population
He goes on to talk
growth,
about poverty as a key driver. So that's it. It's like if we start with that, which you did in your reporting here, you start with that breakdown of the questions, knowing that climate change must be addressed. It feels like it's a better way for us as journalists or for society generally to at least start to break this issue down into pieces that are addressable. Any quick thoughts, Jessica, and then we'll close with Harry. And thanks again for your time.
I guess my quick thought is when you mentioned Africa, you have the slides from Colombia. And so my interest in the juxtaposition between the way that we talk about climate change and the what some communities might need, like those poorer communities in sub-Saharan Africa, I gained an interest in that while I was at Columbia. So I was the first class of the Climate Society program, which eventually got roped under their new climate school. But the role of scientists too in shaping public risk perception and understanding of what was going on, that I saw all that there, and that was really what got me interested in like where these narratives come from, how science is being shaped to push some not just narratives but policy objectives that really I think only benefit science itself, or let's say people in science. And that like self-feeding machine I started to see there. I mean, other wonderful things I saw there too, but that was most apparent in my experience there.
I was muted. Sorry. Our dogs were barking.
Jessica, actually, I have a question for you, which is because I was talking about this earlier, this sort of the danger of undermining the credibility of sturdier science. I'm just curious to know if that's something that you think about or are concerned about too when you see sometimes scientists getting out over their skis with some of these claims.
I do, because science is really important, right? And so when I start a lot of my classes with like, what is science and why do we value it? And people say, it's a methodology and it provides empirical knowledge and it provides knowledge for us to intervene to get things that we want, right? For our society, to improve health, to improve safety, whatever it is. And we lose that when we subvert our integrity for a story, for whatever's flashy, and or to serve our own business interests. And so it is a concern what's going on with science, as you said. And then Andy, like some of the stuff that you've been talking about with NOAA coming out being like, we're actually not steering hurricanes and having to address that. I believe that has to do with the way that we've abused science itself. Because it's ultimately a lack of trust in our really leading institutions of knowledge, and the public starting to be like, well, what are you doing over there? And coming up with stories about what's going on over there, because it's a loss of trust and it's a loss of perceived legitimacy in the institutions of our decision making, of our knowledge making, and it's a problem. It's a serious problem to subvert to undermine the integrity of science for personal and political gain. Yeah,
and while Jessica's turning the self-critical eye on her business, like, I think that same dynamic plays out with journalism too. And I mean, it's reflected in public opinion polls, and trust in journalism is just tanked. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that this is part of it.
Well, and I think one thing that Harry, I think, characterizes your great work is the focus on data, and also the idea that the social sciences are part of this too. Data is not all about carbon dioxide molecules. It's about where people have built houses and the quality of the house and what drove them to be in that place. And, Nadia Popovich at the Times with Brad Plumer, Hannah Ritchie at Our World in Data and her breakthrough on her Substack. There's something distinct about the reporting that emerges from people like journalists like you who are focusing on the data. Now, data can lie too. The University of Washington has a great callingbullshit.org online tutorial for how to for data literacy. But I think it has led to some breakthroughs in newsrooms to do that. So that's why I'm really happy to have you featured here today on this show. And maybe we can talk more about some of these other angles that are really important too. Starting with the data, understanding the importance of climate history, as we said, did several shows on that, and also on the dynamics of society, which are changing more rapidly than the climate is changing in almost every circumstance, is a way to, for the media, for scientists, policymakers who want to be truly honest, to navigate the situation where we have vulnerability change and climate change at the same time. We can do both of those. Grown-ups, it starts with trying to get some baseline of understanding and then moving forward and avoiding narrative capture. So thanks so much. There's still a big audience watching. I'm really pleased about that. So I'm reluctant to call this to a close, but
people, if anyone has like questions or whatever, like I don't have to go right away.
Yeah, let me see. NOAA is a trusted institution. The current politicized environment has placed all information at risk when we are conducting PSYOPs on our own population through disinformation. Yeah, in fact, there was just a new demonstration of that with a Russian-funded blogger slash YouTuber getting some more critiques.
And another thing that's worth mentioning in all of this is that like NOAA is a really impressive scientific organization.
Oh my God, yeah.
They run the National Weather Service, like among many other things. And they do a lot of really great science. So, this isn't about saying like NOAA stinks.
No, not at all.
Just one data set.
Not at all. Again, I've been dealing with this question and relying on NOAA scientists for half of my life, and I have a Social Security card, so it's a long time.
Also, to be clear, like it's not really just the data set itself. I mean, this is data that's worth collecting. What is the economic damage from natural hazards to society? Like that's important data that we can
absolutely
have. So it's just the interpretation of it.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So this is an issue that I'm running into right now because I'm trying to collect data on the last several years of hurricane losses. And it is incredibly important data to collect, and it is incredibly difficult data at this point to access. So that data had long been collected by the insurance industry, and they would, in a lump sum, share it with whoever in probably it wasn't NOAA at the time, but whoever was responsible, the meteorologist of the time. And you can go back through the history of the monthly weather reports and look at the hurricane reports, not only the meteorological history of the report, the forecasting of it, and then there'd be a line about the total damage. And then at some point, the Hurricane Center started doing their own tropical cyclone reports, and that's fine. So there was like the interest in producing the monthly weather reports, which were published in a journal, or at least as far as the hurricanes goes, they lost interest in doing that because they were doing the TC reports. But the TC reports are now being updated periodically based on the $1 billion disaster set and whatever their methodology is. And that methodology still has rooted in it the industry reported damages, but you can't access it because it's proprietary.
Oh, right, I've heard this.
So
right.
We don't have, just tell me how much Hurricane X cost. And you can't get that data because it's all proprietary, it's private. And that's a problem because we have an insurance problem, we have a disaster problem, and nobody knows what these things cost unless you're looking at $1 billion disaster set that's been kind of molded, and nobody really knows what's underneath it, how it's created, and we don't have the data. It's no longer accessible.
Well, and I know you must have grappled with this, Harry.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a nightmare in terms of the data collection effort. And like a lot of the data, I guess, is from insurance companies, and NOAA has agreements with the insurance companies that they don't release some of the specifics of the losses. But yeah, I mean, NOAA has itself acknowledged the need for greater transparency in the sources of the data that underlies a $1 billion disaster data set. My understanding is they're trying to share more of it, but I guess there's some that they just won't be able to share because they have these private agreements. And also, like, this is getting kind of esoteric, but like there's different types of losses, right? So there's like just like a house got knocked down, that's like a direct loss. And then there's like these indirect losses, which is like, you know, what kind of business activity was disrupted and things like that. And that gets a lot more, that's much harder to quantify. Because like there's all these confounding factors, like let's say that the Florida orange industry is disrupted. Well, that's an economic loss, but then like maybe the Mexican orange industry was benefited from that, and so that's an economic gain. Or like, you know, a bunch of trees got knocked down, that's a loss, but then like the arborists get to come in and clean them up, and that's a gain. So it's really hard to disentangle it, and that's why some researchers prefer to just look at like direct losses, because that's like the simplest thing to quantify. But NOAA also includes like these indirect losses into their tally, but you can't figure out like what's a direct loss and what's an indirect loss. Also, like there are insured losses and uninsured losses.
Right.
And insured losses are like really easy to count because the insurance companies just have those numbers. But then they have estimates of like what's the insurance penetration in this area. So what percentage of property is uninsured? And then they have to make estimates, and there's uncertainties with those estimates. And so even if you had all the data, like Jessica's saying, like even if it was like perfect access to the data, like there would still be some challenges, but hiding the data or not making it completely transparent is pretty problematic. I mean, another thing is like, so NOAA also is keeping track of events that cause less than $1 billion in damage. And we know that because they say so, and also because sometimes inflation causes disasters that cost less than $1 billion in the past to become $1 billion disasters in the present. And so like, if those events are getting included in the new $1 billion disaster data set, that must mean that NOAA was tracking them before. And they've said like, yes, we're tracking these ones. And they now are saying that they're going to make an effort to like clean that data and get it ready and also share the sub $1 billion disasters. But that might take a while. But that would also be like really useful. And you talk to disaster researchers like Jessica, and they all say like, we just want transparency. Like this is a pretty basic ask of scientific researchers, to just be transparent about your data. So.
Yeah, boy. And this also gets muddied because, you know, how insurance companies set their rates then is dependent on data. That if we can't double check that, then how do you know they're not gaming the system? And then you get also into the reinsurance part of this, which is the insurance companies that insure insurance companies. There's a lot of money behind all this as well. So having opacity on data and a lot of money at the same place means there's a good opportunity for reporters, I guess, you know, to sort of see if there's a way to shed a light there. Right, light is is what we can bring to these issues as journalists. And there have been other angles on that front that I think need to be dug in on. Any last thoughts? Otherwise, this has been great, and I don't see.
My last thought.
There are some questions, actually. Sorry, I didn't scroll through them. Someone who goes by the moniker Witty Wombat says, "What is your view on the real estate lobby getting away with building in high hazard areas under the pretext of climate change? It's causing the harm, and it's not them." But which is kind of something we were talking about, if I'm transliterating that comment.
I don't know. I guess I don't know that they're getting away with it so much as it's the problem is then the decision makers making decision about what can do, what the rules are, right? So like it's really our policymakers being able to stand up against business and whoever and say, no, this is what we're going to do for the community. But building on that, though, there's an excellent book called Underwater by Rebecca Elliott a couple of years ago. And she tracks the National Flood Insurance Program and some controversy about the maps. And through that is the history of the social history of the program itself and its mapping process. And really, it's so much of an economic benefit to a community, to a state, to the nation to develop that it's just sort of goes forward, right? Like we owe a fair amount of our GDP to development and all the financing that goes along with that, to particularly home ownership, right? And that's been a major tool for middle class wealth creation. We get a mortgage, we build equity, we pay for retirement, we pay for college educations, we do all sorts of stuff with that.
Right.
And so it becomes this idea where it's not just like evil developers. There is a social interest in enabling this to continue. And we also lose that conversation about our public insurance programs, about insurance, about home ownership, about development, when we just say, oh, it's climate change. Like there's a whole other economic factor that goes in there that's really significant for the nation. We cannot afford to just walk away from Florida and say, it's Florida, let it tank. Like Florida is a substantial portion of the national GDP, and a big part of that is mortgages and building and financing.
And you're right. It's getting the incentives right is key, which is, I think, a rationale for another conversation. Because also my dogs are barking at the propane delivery. We have a generator to deal with climate risk here when the power goes out in Maine, and so our heat pumps can't work in the with no electricity. This has been great. There's a lot of people watching, but they're going to have to come back for another future session. And I'm overdue to get some insurance folks on here to talk about that end of it, because it really is important. And I'm glad you mentioned Rebecca's work. She might be someone to get into the conversation too. And Harry, I know you've got work to do because, there's so many issues in the next few weeks and months ahead related to this. So thanks again for being on the show, Jessica. And
thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andy.
Maybe we'll do it again after the election. But everyone should read this story. Go to WashingtonPost.com, find it, dig in, get out of your narrative, any narrative capture you might have. Joe Whitty, who used to be the NBC weather and climate reporter, retired now, says he's out there listening and watching. A lot of other people are too. Neil Halloran says thank you, and JP Isham. So thanks to everyone. This is Sustain What. It's all iterative. There's no simple story here, no simple conclusion, but we can get some of these metrics better and build a safer world by shrinking the expanding bullseye that we have built and are still building in too many places. Thank you, and share this with others when we're done, which is momentarily. The links all persist that you've been watching on.
Cool.
Hold on.
Well, thanks for having me again, Andy. And